In drawing, a common problem is what is often referred to as textures. If we don't get the surface textures well rendered, then we can end up with something where there's so much ink, there's so much detail with various degrees of accuracy that it can be hard at times to see the actual object for all the surface textures. While there's no right way to do any one of these, there are ways that can inject a sense of visual realism into our drawing better than the all-over patterns that we often see. Let me explain for 4 of them the approach I take to create effective textures, realistic looking textures when I draw. And the first one is the corrugated iron sheeting that is so common, particularly in Australia. Rectangular iron sheets that are laid in rows, slightly overlapping each other, and it's the ripple effect of the iron sheeting that creates the distinctive visual characteristics it has. Over time, these sheets can rust and they can warp. Where they join, there is often a slight indication of shadows when one sheet has raised slightly from another. And at the top, where they go under straight flashing, there are shadows created which create a certain visual effect. At the base, where we have the guttering in front, we may see even more of the fluting. Other thing to realise with this is that these vertical channels of fluting change angle as they move to each side of the viewer. These are some of the visual distinctivenesses that we want to try and capture. Now, I don't want to be drawing every single line and draw everything in detail, because most of the time when we see corrugated sheeting roofs, we are aware of the surface texture without it overpowering visually what we're looking at. So we don't want our rendering to overpower. Here we have the flashing. Here we have the corrugations, and I've just done dots in various parts to suggest the shadows that are formed where the corrugations go under the flashing. So we don't want to be doing this rendering equally all over, because when we look at something, some parts stand out more, particularly the closer parts. So in this very small cottage, I've done more and heavier detail in the corner that's closest to us. I've also shown here how we can see some of the quite distorted edge of the corrugations, and just some dots to indicate the shadows up the top. In a larger structure, we have joins where the sheeting goes under a higher row, and that provides a point where shadows can catch. But again, the closer ones are rendered more heavily than the further ones. And also paying attention to the direction of the corrugations and showing that towards the sides they start to splay outwards. The older and more weathered the sheeting is, the more visual impact it often has, and therefore the more rendering of it we can do to capture the effect of what we're seeing. In fact, the sheeting can start to be stained with rust, which creates a further visual effect we can try and capture. But even when we have a lot of visual texture in view, we still want to be careful not to do it in such an overpowering way that it draws more attention for the overall subject in our drawing than we have in the reference. The further away we go, the lighter the approach, the less detail we show, because this mimics the effect of real life. The next common surface area whose texture so often produces difficulties for the artist is grass. Such a complex texture, and yet often a relatively unimportant part of the overall drawing scene, and certainly one where often we don't want to spend too much time. The most important thing to remember about grass and any ground level surface texture is that what we see at the very front is much, much closer than even what we have a short distance away. And once we go some distance away, visually what we see is incredibly different to what we see much closer. And one of the biggest problems with how grass is often drawn is that basically the same effect is drawn over all of the grassed area, when that's not the way it looks in life. Just as buildings are foreshortened, narrow, as they move further away, the ground is like foreshortening this way. The ground moves away and what we see changes as it moves further away. Except that the ground often foreshortens in a very extreme way. So the marks we use to capture the effect of the grass as it moves away, as it foreshortens, as it visually changes, needs to reflect those changes. It's not just the grass, but it's anything on the ground, whether it's sticks or leaves or shadows, as it moves further away, needs to become foreshortened, needs to narrow, until when we get some distance away, if we have any rendering, it's really just horizontal lines for what are quite thick shadows closer towards us. But when we do grass, even when we're not actually rendering much grass, this means that however we show the grass that's closest to us, we need to very rapidly and significantly change how it looks, simplify what we draw, and make smaller marks as it moves further away. And that creates quite a realistic effect of distance. Now, sometimes this is affected by the fact that grass in the midground might be longer than the grass in the foreground, but doing things such as using a slightly heavier hand to get a darker mark can help still give a sense that this is closer. We don't actually have to draw much of the grass in detail at all to create a very strong feeling and understanding that this is grassed all the way back to this line here. In fact, the challenge here is to control our marks and not to draw too much, too large, too quickly. A very few marks can create a wonderful sense of grass. And even when our subject is much closer, again, we see the principle of closest to us, we're actually here drawing blades of grass, but we only go back a matter of 6-8 inches, and we're just using lines now to represent the blades of grass. So even in a relatively shallow depth of plane, we change our marks to create a realistic effect of grass moving further away. More, larger, darker in the front, less so in the midground, and very little in the distance. When there are shadows on the grass, well, we use our principle of the underline form for the direction of our hatching. But because our hatching lines are reflecting the form of the grass, as the grass moves further back, our hatching lines need to become shorter, lighter, and more sparse. Because in effect, we're drawing the grass in the shadows with the hatching lines. And how very rapidly we go from foreground, midground, greatly reduced, and distance, almost nothing at all. Another problem, texture area, particularly for people who like architecture, is brickwork. So often, the problem is that the brickwork is drawn in too much detail. Once we start drawing bricks, it's hard to know where to stop. There's so much ink in the brickwork on the wall that we no longer notice the wall. All we notice is what's really a pattern of bricks that we've drawn. A more effective way I use is to work hard at not drawing too much of the brickwork, at suggesting the brickwork. The important thing when we do this, whenever we use lines to define a brick or part of a brick, is to get the scale correct. The number of bricks that we suggest on a wall is pretty close to the real number of bricks on the wall, whether we draw them all or whether we just draw a part of it. And we have the horizontal lines to suggest the spaces of mortar between the bricks, and we have the vertical lines as well. Generally, I don't render them to the same degree. I favour the horizontal lines, and with those, I need to make sure that they follow the perspective angles of that wall. I often just do a few vertical lines in the closest part of the brickwork and then more a series of dots. Because if I start drawing too precisely, it's very hard to know where to stop. And I have to be very precise for it to look right. And sometimes we can choose to put more detail than other times. I did more here because I was rendering shade on the front wall, and I still wanted the suggestions of the brickwork to stand out. Sometimes we only have to suggest small parts, and sometimes individual bricks are either a different colour or they've become stained for some reason, and we can make marks to indicate that. Again though, I don't want to become too precise because then I have to be incredibly accurate for it to look right. I'm trying to create the effect, not the precision. And whenever I colour or highlight an individual brick, I need to pay particular attention to keeping the size, the scale of that brick in proportion to the scale of the overall wall. It can be helpful to show a little more detail for certain elements of the architecture that are defined with the brickwork, but I haven't let myself get too precise in the rendering. And notice the way I've rendered the bricks is very different visually to the way I've rendered the stones in the wall. But in each case, I haven't let my rendering of these overwhelm the drawing, which they would have done if I'd drawn them more carefully and over the whole area. Where we have a long length of brickwork, then we want to capture the effect that we see more of the brickwork more clearly closer than we do further away. And so the suggestion of brickwork in my marks rapidly becomes lighter and smaller as it moves away. And don't forget that where we have brickwork on walls going off in another direction, we want to give some indication of brickwork at least somewhere closer to the viewer. A lot depends on how close we are. When we're quite close and there are discoloured bricks, then we'll need a little more detail to capture that. But we still don't want to get caught doing too much. Less is almost always better, but concentrate on the closest part and concentrate on getting the size of the brick correct for the size of the wall at that distance. Further away, a lighter touch, and varying very much the amount of detail we do on the one wall, so that our focus is drawn to a part that lets us understand what the wall's made of, but we still see the overall wall rather than bricks. And this works just the same way for large blocks of stone, another common building material for early Australian buildings. And it's exactly the same principle for paving stones. Getting the perspective angles correct, more detail closer that rapidly disappears. And of course, the foreshortening that we talked about for grass happens just as much in the same way for the pavers on the road. Foliage continues to be a big problem for many people, and it's easy to understand why. We know there are so many leaves there, and we start drawing leaves and we become overwhelmed. What often happens is that people then end up developing a pattern that in some way for them represents the leaves. The problem is it's not usually very realistic or very effective and can make the trees look very flat and two-dimensional. I find the most helpful way is to see the tree canopy as a shape with three-dimensional form and not worry about the leaves particularly. And we mostly see this shape because of the way the light casts shadows and creates shade on it. So that's what we're trying to draw. And it doesn't matter whether it's a relatively small, simple tree or whether it's a larger, complex tree that we're going to spend more time drawing. The principle is the same. The entire tree canopy may be, if you like, one ball of foliage, or we may have numerous balls of overlapping foliage that each catch shade and cast shadow in different ways. We're really drawing the tree by drawing the shadows and the shade that's created. We use our hatch direction in a way to reinforce the direction the underlying form that the hatching is on. So more straight up and down for the straight side of the hedge, but more curving under for the rounded bunches of foliage. Avoiding a heavy outline around the edges of our canopy usually will create a far more realistic effect. And we can, in fact, emphasize parts of the canopy that are closer to us, because in life we see them more clearly. Even in a fast drawing with simple line work, the principles can be applied. If we're actually quite close up to a tree and so we can see the individual leaves more, again, as with the bricks, we don't want to start getting caught drawing all the leaves, but we want to draw at least some parts of the canopy, particularly at the edges, which we see more clearly, in a way that's more suggestive of individual leaves. But the marks we make, the marks we choose to do this, are important for the effect they create. And when we have different trees, we need to use different marks to create the different effect that the different foliage and therefore canopies create. This looks like it's a combination of all different trees. This is drawn from a single photo, and all of these trees were naturally occurring this close together. Some are closer than others, and while I use marks such as this quite often, particularly for our Australian eucalyptus trees, and it works very well for those, when we have a whole range of different types of trees in the one scene, we want our drawing to show that there are different types of trees. And the principle is the same for small foliage as well. It doesn't have to be a grand oak. The same principle applies when trees are very much a support act in the distance, but we again highly simplify what we're doing. We're suggesting a tree, we're not drawing the detail of a tree. If trees are an issue for you, I have a trees playlist of all things foliage, if you might find that helpful. And we often need to adjust how we do it so that some foliage appears closer and other foliage appears further away. Every single drawing you've seen in this video has its own video demonstrating its drawing with a voiceover particularly describing in detail what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, if you're interested in more detail on any one of these areas. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope this has been helpful for drawing some of these difficult, if you like, texture areas in the subjects that we love to draw. So why not give it a go? But whatever you draw and however you render it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.